All right, we are so excited to have Robert Loss back with us. Hopefully you remember his fantastic presentation from 40GB30. But today we are talking about deconstruction, work, and racial capitalism in the Rainbow Children. And yes, we'll be talking about Avalanche. Take it away, Robert.
All right, thank you, D'Angela. Thank you for all the work that you do. It's an honor and privilege to be here and to be with all of you and to be on this panel. I'm going to start like Rachel Maddow sometimes starts her shows. I don't know if you all watch her show, but sometimes she says something like, well, we've got a lot to talk about today, right? There's a lot in the news, but I'm going to start with Cape Girardeau, Missouri, 1846 or something. And this is me basically copying her approach. And I am talk about the Rainbow Children. I am going to talk about Avalanche, of course. And I promise by the end, it all makes some kind of sense. So Greenwich Village, New York City, 1938. A guy named Arnie Josephson wants to open New York's first integrated nightclub, but he needs startup money. So he turns to John Hammond. John Hammond was already very influential as a music producer for Columbia Records and a jazz critic, Downbeat. He was considered left-wing. He was on the board of the NAACP. He championed black jazz artists like Count Basie and Billie Holiday. So Hammond gives Josephson $5,000 in startup money, and the club opens that year, 1938, the first integrated club in New York City. It was called the Cafe Society. Now, as you may know, Billie Holiday first performed Strange Fruit live in 1939, the next year. And as it turned out, she performed it for the first time at the Cafe Society. One of the most important anti-racist songs in history, performed at the first racially integrated club in New York. What you might not know, though, is that Billie Holiday was a Columbia recording artist. And when she wanted to record Strange Fruit for Columbia in 1939, John Hammond said no. Around that time, Hammond also instructed a friend to stop managing Holiday because of her drug habits. Holiday never performed at the Cafe Society again. Columbia did make an exception, allowing Holiday to record Strange Fruit for Commodore, a much smaller label, and that recording sold 1 million copies. Now, Holiday had significant problems with drugs and alcohol, and the story goes that when she died in 1959, she had only $750 in life savings strapped to her leg. But it's worth remembering that in her memoir, Lady Sings the Blues, Holiday recalled that when Hammond paired her with bandleader Teddy Wilson, she got, quote, $30 for making half a dozen sides, 6 records. And when she complained, Hammond didn't stick up for her. So Hammond is still considered by a lot of people a hero for integrating the music business. But outside of academia and some jazz aficionados, I think not a lot of people really know about this other side of John Hammond. And they might ask, well, how could they find this out? They could ask, how could a guy who championed black artists and did so much to integrate the music business still do some of these things, right? These things that exploit black labor. And the answer to that question is racial capitalism. Racial capitalism is a concept mostly associated with Cedric Robinson in his 1983 book, Black Marxism, The Making of a Black Radical Tradition. Though Robinson didn't coin the term, in that book he really filled out what racial capitalism means. And he did so by looking at the history of capitalism. Robinson's key insight was this, that racialism predates capitalism. The feudal structure that existed in Europe before capitalism's emergence was already racialized. The Irish, Slavs, Roma, Jews, etc. were distinguished as inferior to Anglo-Saxons, for instance. So unfree labor existed in Europe before the transatlantic slave trade. In other words, racism has always been a constitutive element of capitalism, even before the violent enslavement of Africans. Robinson sums it up neatly. He says, the development, organization, and expansion of capitalist society pursued essentially racial directions, and so too did its ideology. as a material force, then it could be expected that racialism would inevitably permeate the social structures emergent from capitalism. All that's a quote from Cedric Robinson. We see then that all capitalism is racial capitalism. Or as the geographer Ruth Wilson Gilmore puts it, she's fantastic, capitalism requires inequality and racism enshrines it. So that's a very brisk overview of 700 years of world history. But I'll leave it there for a moment. I'll hit you with this. Whether or not Prince would have called it racial capitalism, by 2000 and 2001 at the very least, he knew exactly what racial capitalism was. So last year at the DM40GB30 symposium, I argued that with Graffiti Bridge in 1990, Prince began to more fully understand himself as a historical subject, that is, subject to and subjugated by the predations of systemic white supremacy and capitalism's exploitation of black labor, racial capitalism. So this understanding continued to evolve because of his conflict with Warner Brothers, of course, but his critique was never limited to his own situation. He began to focus more on the self-sufficiency of the black community, black ownership, and self-determination. By exploring the internet as a means of distribution, by continuing to advocate for black musicians, and through his philanthropy, Prince was already critiquing racial capitalism. But I do think that the Rainbow Children marks another turning point. And I do see it as the full flowering, the most complete expression across an entire album of Prince's evolving thoughts about race, labor, capitalism, the working class, and crucially, history. And I think we can begin to understand this by looking first at the motif of work in his music. Work in Prince's songs sometimes had expressed the doldrums of working part-time at a 5 and dime, but more often, especially as a trait of performance and ethos, it had been framed pretty positively, progressively, and as something constructive. And crucially, it had been somewhat integrationist in the sense that it could work through capitalism, or at least despite capitalism. So that began changing in the 1990s, but it changed drastically with the Rainbow Children. Work, I think it's worth pointing out, is the 14th word on the album. With the accurate understanding of God and his law, they went about the work of building a new nation. So immediately we have a fusion of labor, theocracy, and nationhood. But the telling sequence on the album's, in the album's narrative begins 2 songs later on Digital Garden. Here the banished ones, envious of this new nation, return to the palace at its center and build the digital garden around it. The garden uses, quote, the lies promoted by the media. And we ask, whose media exactly are we talking about? Well, we find out explicitly in the work part 1. Every time I watch the Other People news, Prince sings, I see a false picture of myself, another one of you. So the media here is controlled by a white power structure. And if the banished ones were once members of the Rainbow Children, and I'm not exactly sure that I am totally, let me start again. If the banished ones were once members of the Rainbow Children, then depending on how we sort of understand the Rainbow Children, they are quite possibly white people who have been misled into cooperating with white supremacy. But I think that's debatable. In other words, I think it depends on how we define who the Rainbow Children are. That was something I kind of hoped that we would discuss in the Q&A. After negotiation with the wise one, the banished ones leave, and this is the lyric, or the spoken word part. As for the Rainbow Children, they began deconstructing the digital garden. Door to door, they went in search of those willing to do the work, which clearly alludes to the evangelical work of Jehovah's Witnesses, and more broadly to the work done by black churches in the United States to fight oppression. On the Rainbow Children, then, Prince's criticisms of capitalism become even sharper and focus on its constitutive white supremacy. For instance, in the work part 1, he asks, what is left to give when your work is done? What do we own besides the right to crawl? Now that would have probably fit in with a lot of his 1990s songs, but he immediately follows that up with, see, we're living in a system that the devil designed. Additionally, he sings, this work is the kind that turns your back on the ruling class by putting them in their place just like the past. And a family name, which I know we've talked a lot about today, he says the devil has been hiding, to the quote, hiding behind corporate eyes and later chastises a preacher who rides around in a Lexus coupe and drives us to the cleaners in a pinstripe suit. On Everlasting Now, when Prince sings, "You can't teach a dog new tricks if his tail don't wag," I think of critical race theorist Bell's concept of interest convergence, which stipulates that Black people achieve civil rights victories only when white and Black interests converge. It's a critique of the civil rights movement. In other words, only when civil rights legislation advances white interests as well. So instead of work being a straightforward construction that coexists at least with capitalism, the Rainbow Children's narrative situates the work as a necessary deconstruction of oppressive structures that have a long historical trace. We are all today born into structures of racial capitalism, including the institutions of education and media that were built through the exploitation, colonization, dispossession of primarily non-white people. These structures are both materialist and ideological. They have a tangible institutional basis and real effects, but they're also built on ideas, arguments, and myths. So for the sake of the pluralistic, free, and equitable future that he always imagined, Prince dramatizes here on the Rainbow Children that labor must be directed toward the dismantling of these structures and the concepts that enshrine them. In other words, Prince is redefining labor and saying that for this work to ultimately be constructive, it must first deconstruct. I think we can totally see how the criticism of capital on the Rainbow Children aligns quite a bit with Black liberation theology, which according to one of its founders, James H. Cone, quote, relates the forces of liberation on behalf of the non-white oppressed to the essence of the gospel, which is Jesus Christ. This liberation movement has always targeted economic exploitation. And for merely one example of that, I'll quote Martin Luther King circa 1966. He says, "You can talk about ending the slums without first saying profit must be taken out of the slums." Now this means, he says, that we are treading in difficult water because it really means that what we are saying, something is wrong with capitalism. As we know, this aspect of Martin Luther King's message has been marginalized, obscured, and erased by white-dominated media in history. And these are two more things that need to be deconstructed. The most explicit example of this on the Rainbow Children is Family Name, which dramatizes how the names of enslaved Africans were changed to names that would bear the mark of their oppression long after slavery ended. Again, this was a feature of racial capitalism's dispossession. It's a strategy dispossession. But this, of course, has been historically concealed. So Prince is really bringing this back into the light so that we can see it and educate ourselves and other folks about it. So for instance, then, when a Black American today changes their name to an African name and is accused privately or publicly on Twitter or something of disloyalty to American culture or some kind of inauthenticity because they don't live in Africa or some other nonsense, those accusations, intentionally or not, obscure the racial capitalism that changed the family name in the first place. So to deconstruct this digital garden, we have to deconstruct history and knowledge and power. And that brings me to Avalanche. But because I want to keep you on your toes, I want to ask a trivia question first. And yes, it's relevant. In the book, The Beautiful Ones, Prince names his father, John L. Nelson's favorite, most inspirational jazz musician. Who was that musician? I don't have a prize for you, but you put your answer in the comments if you wish. Now, some of you are probably thinking, why is he including Avalanche in a presentation about the Rainbow Children? Though after the earlier discussion today, the roundtable, I think most of you are on board with this. The truth is, at this point, I really think of the Rainbow Children without thinking about Avalanche. It was recorded directly after the Rainbow Children, as we know, in spring 2001. It was played on the US leg of the One Night Alone tour, and on most nights, as was mentioned in the roundtable, it was played as it appears on the live album, which is directly preceding Family Name. I don't think any of this is coincidental. As a piece of music, Avalanche starts delicately, somberly. Prince sings, "He was not or never had been in favor of setting our people free." And before you even know that the he is Abraham Lincoln, you might be stunned by Prince's icy falsetto, a voice that soars with rich gospel tones as it strips back a foundational layer of white American innocence with the lyric, he was not nor ever had been in favor of letting us vote. So you see, Abraham Lincoln was a racist who said, you cannot escape from, and when Prince sings history, the last word of that line, he sent it spiraling up into stratosphere on this falsetto that is as pure as it is pained, a mirror image of the white innocence that the song is here to demolish. Avalanche continues the work of deconstructing American history done on Rainbow Children. It shows what that work entails. First, it requires the critique and dismissal of common mythologies. Second, it requires that we examine the true historical record. When Prince sings, he was not nor ever had been in favor, he's quoting a line spoken by Lincoln during the Lincoln-Douglas debates in 1858. And in fact, one source I have is from a speech given here in Columbus, Ohio, where I'm at, on September 16th, 1859, at which Lincoln opens by referring to what he calls an erroneous report in the Ohio Statesman, which claimed that Lincoln favored black suffrage. I don't have time to go into the different nuances of Lincoln's thinking, but while it did change, much thanks to Frederick Douglass, and while Lincoln was responsible for two of the significant anti-racist acts in American history, it's still true that Abraham Lincoln was a racist. W.E.B. Du Bois described him well. He said he was a man, a big, inconsistent, brave man. Lincoln's individual racism is also not the entire point of this song. What Prince refers to, when Prince refers to the avalanche in the chorus, like the snow falling down the mountain that landed on Wounded Knee, nobody wants to take the weight of the responsibility. He's talking about something literal and using it as a metaphor. In 1890, troops of the United States Army massacred Lakota tribespeople at Wounded Knee Creek in South Dakota, and immediately afterwards, a blizzard struck the area, and the bodies couldn't be retrieved for 3 days. So in one sense, Prince is implying a concealment of the historical record, but with the metaphor, he's also calling out the myth-making of white innocence, which affords white people the privilege of not taking responsibility for the historical legacies of repression from which they have benefited. Oppression which is founded on a system of racial capitalism. Which brings me back to John Hammond and introduces into the picture Duke Ellington, who was, according to Prince, in The Beautiful Ones, John L. Nelson's favorite musician. Now, in the second verse of Avalanche, Ellington and his band are creating the joyous sound of freedom, sings Prince, in Harlem. But, quote, lurking in the shadows is John Hammond with his pen in hand. So this is nothing less than the intervention of white supremacy into the sphere of self-sufficient black art. The history here is really interesting, and I think it's instructive. In 1935, John Hammond wrote an article for Downbeat entitled The Tragedy of Duke Ellington, the Black Prince of Jazz, a musician of great talent forsakes simplicity for pretension. A scathingly condescending review of Ellington's piece, reminiscing in tempo. Hammond said Ellington's work was un-Negroid, too influenced by European composers like Claude Debussy, adding that it would probably take a Granville Hicks or a Langston Hughes to describe the way that he shuts his eyes to the abuses being heaped on his people and his original class. Again, that's John Hammond saying that. If you know Ellington's music, you know that this is ridiculous. Is it possible that professional envy drove Hammond's criticisms as much as his rigid ideology and racial romanizations? In the 1920s and 30s, in fact, Ellington recorded sides for nearly every single record label there was, including Columbia. And in doing so, he remained more independent. However, in Avalanche, Prince pulls off a neat little narrative trick because suddenly Hammond is talking not to Ellington, but to you, a presumably young and eager musician given the context of the song, presumably black, presumably a jazz musician, who Hammond is tempting to sign to an exploitative contract for Columbia Records, which might be like Billie Holiday's $30 for 6 records contract, or like the contracts Hammond signed Bessie Smith to, which included a small fixed fee for each performance she recorded and no royalties. He sings, but you ain't got no money and you ain't got no cash, so you sign your name and he, Hammond, claims innocence just like every snowflake in an avalanche. And I'm almost done here. So in one breathtaking metaphor, Prince fuses predatory record contracts racially motivated genocide, and the history of Black enslavement in the United States. And for me, that's one of the most remarkable things about this song is the songwriting. The avalanche, this avalanche that he's talking about, is racial capitalism. It is, in fact, a series of avalanches, the unrelenting force of white supremacy fused with capitalism throughout history, landing on people of color. Why does the young Black musician have no cash? Because of these historical and sometimes invisible forces. And when they stay invisible, they enable white innocence, silence actual history, and turn the social construction of racial capitalism into a mythic natural disaster. It is the so-called natural quality that allows some to venerate someone like Hammond by saying, well, that's just how the music business works or worked, instead of acknowledging that while, yes, Hammond did some good, he was still actively perpetuating a system that made millions off of underpaid Black artistic labor. In The Fire Next Time, James Baldwin writes, "It is not permissible that the authors of devastation should also be innocent. It is the innocence which constitutes the crime." It is a crime because while by hiding the historical continuities, the reverberations of this system of racial capitalism, white people then and now can deny culpability. And meanwhile, the oppressed remain oppressed. It is ultimately the system to which Prince is drawing our attention. So on the Rainbow Children and Avalanche, Prince is not only examining his own history as a Black man in America, the son of working class jazz musicians, and as a musician who was himself exploited by racial capitalism, he's building a historical understanding of racial capitalism to recognize his father and his mother, to recognize Billie Holiday, to recognize Duke Ellington, and to recognize all the others who have fought for social and economic justice and liberation. And he's doing this for the sake of the future too. And that's the note I want to end on, which is a hopeful note. I hope that you'll take it that way, that he's doing this for the sake of the next Billie Holiday and the next Duke Ellington. So they will know from the beginning what the deal is. Quite frankly, the deconstructive work then requires a painful confrontation with history, with media, with white supremacy and capitalism, but ultimately then it can become constructive. And this better future is the good news of the Black radical tradition. Thank you very, very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Robert. If you don't mind stopping sharing your screen so we can see you. We have a couple of requests. We want to see you more. We have time for a couple of questions, and both of them are from Rakabash, and they're really good questions. So the first question he asked was Prince signing Mavis Staples, George Clinton, Chaka Khan, and Larry Graham way of repairing the ways the aforementioned were victims of racial capitalism?
I think absolutely so. Yeah, I mean, we see him starting to reconnect with Black musicians who came before him in the late 1980s. And that's, when Paisley Park is coming together. And so, yeah, I absolutely think it is. It's an idea of trying to create an alternative system within capitalism that can function. And I think that's where we get into, at that point, I think he was still, a little more enthusiastic about the potential of capitalism. And yet then I think, by 2000 or so, I think he was just much more aware of all of the dangers and problems of it. And, whenever anybody criticizes capitalism on Twitter, or somebody pops up and says, well, how come you don't just give away everything for free? And the answer is because we live in a capitalist system, right? Like we're all in that system. We're trying to change it while we're, it's like the flying the plane while trying to fix the plane thing, right? So I think that's a really important point. And I think it matters very much that it didn't include just younger proteges, but his forebears. Yeah, for sure. That's a good question.
Awesome. So I want to ask the second question because we have time. It's also from Rakabash, another really good question. Will major record labels losing their value and hold on the market share of the industry equalize the imbalance of Black artists earning a fairer share of their earnings?
So assuming that that's kind of referring to like what's happening now in terms of like streaming revenue, I wish I could say that it would. I'm not optimistic. Record labels have found a way to adjust. They have found a way to monetize, and they are they are not making the money that they were. And of course, like any other corporation, when they're not making the money they were making at the top, they try to conserve it as much as possible by paying as much further on down the ladder. So I think the best alternative right now is for Black-owned businesses, record labels, ad agencies, record. What am I trying to say? Like publicists and a whole network of Black artists and in the entertainment industry to really just keep increasing what they're doing, because I think now is a good time to try to get more of a hold in the industry. I wish I could be totally optimistic about the future, but that's what I got right now.
And one more, I think this is a quick question, but it's a good question. Do you think Prince's stance on intellectual property rights / copyright was linked to his views on racial capitalism?
Yes, I do. And that's a really complex issue because you can kind of make the argument both ways. And of course, we're in a historical situation in which the copyrights for things that were made for Black artists, without them getting the benefits, in some ways, it might be better if that copyright ended. But of course, copyright intellectual property is an absolutely crucial element of protecting Black ownership of labor and intellectual property. So, yeah, I think that's a great topic for a panel. I'd love to hear that.
Definitely. Thank you so much for your questions from the audience. Thank you for this incredible presentation, Robert, and the time that you took to craft it for us. We are really appreciative of it. And next up, we are going to room hop so we can hear Kanissa's presentation. So it will start hopefully on time in like a minute. So definitely be on the lookout for Kanissa's presentation, because if anybody loves the Rainbow Children, Kanissa Williams loves the Rainbow Children. So you want to make sure that you from her. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.